Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Mem Aleph. There's a bunch of very interesting things. Certainly, they teach you a little bit about their society, and then you might find some surprises. So, specifically about giving birth to daughters and giving birth to twins. So, with that, we will get started. The Mishnah had two parts. So, first, the Gemara is going to deal with the first part, as usual, and then the second part. So, the first part, just to review the first part right now, is somebody has sons, daughters, and a tumtum. And the question is, the tumtum wants to get inheritance or food. And we said that depends on whether there's a lot of money in the estate, not a lot of money in the estate, whether the boys get it, the girls get it. So if there's a lot of money, the boys get the inheritance, and the tumtum, they say, oh, go get with the girls. And if there's not a lot of money and the girls get first priority and get the mizonot, then the tumtum is told, oh, go get with the boys. And basically each one can push them off. We saw that Abaye and Rava had a debate in the Mishnah about whether when they push them off, does that mean they push them off and the tumtum can collect with the other group? Or does it mean the tumtum, no, push them off to the other group, and the other group pushes them off also and say, you can't prove, right? You can get with me. And that really all depended on whether we think that a tumtum is what we call a biryah b'fnei atzma, not zachar, not nekev, not male, not female, and therefore won't get anything. Or whether we say, well, that's a subject of debate, and different parts of the Mishnah follow different things, which is what we ended with Rava. But in the first part of the Mishnah, they actually think a tumtum is a safek zachar, safek nekev. We're not sure male or female. So the tumtum gets like one of them, but the worst option. Okay, so if the girls get less, he'll get with the girls. If the boys get less, he'll get with the boys. Or to call it he, it will get with the boys. Okay, so now the Gemara wanted to raise a difficulty with Abaye, who says the tumtum doesn't get anything at all. Well, look at the following braita, 2 lines from the bottom of Kuf Mem at Amud Bet. Tumtum yoresh keben v'nizon kebat. Okay, that sounds pretty much like the tumtum inherits like a boy and gets mizonot like a girl. Okay, first of all, this doesn't make any sense because what do you mean? We just said the girls can push him off and the boys can push him off. So Bishlam Rava, according to Rava, though, we have a way to explain this. What does it mean? Yoresh keben nizon kebat depends on the scenario. Yoresh keben b'nechasim muatim. If there's not a lot of money and the boys don't inherit, well, then the tumtum is in the category with the boys. Well, and you have to explain, and we'll get there soon, but then they don't get anything anyway. So what are we even talking about? But we'll get back to that. And nizon kebat b'nechasim merubim. Gets mizona like the girls. That's when there's a lot of possessions. And then the tumtum is pushed off by the boys, can't get the inheritance, but can get with the girls. And that fits with Rava, who said, again, in the words of Rava, dochinoto v'yeshlo. They push him off, but he does get with the other category. Elala Abaye, ma'nizon kebat. But according to Abaye, there is no case where he gets mizono like the girls, right? Definitely doesn't. We just said, according to Abaye, ain't low. Doesn't get anything. Everyone pushes him off and says, you're not male, you're not female, because you're something else. To which the Gemara goes back to that line that I said was problematic, even according to Rava. As a counter and as a way to respond to the question, they raise a counter question on Rava and say, but Rava doesn't have a way to explain Yoresh Keben, because if there's not enough money, then what happens? The girls get mizonot and the boys don't inherit at all. So how could you say he inherits like the boys? It means he can't get mizono like the girls, which means he should inherit like the boys, but we don't allow him to inherit because he can't even prove he's a boy. We'll explain the same thing according to Abaye. When it says gets mizono with the girls, it means, well, he should have got mizono with the girls because he can't inherit with the boys, because, right, in Nechasim Rubim, there's enough money, the boys inherit, the boys could say, you're not male, and then should get mizono at least something like the girls, but even that he doesn't get. And that's how they explain the braita. It doesn't mean he actually gets. It means potentially he should because he can't get the other option, but we're not going to give him that either. And therefore, we end up with explanation as to how this braita could fit with Abaye as well. By the way, the whole question, Ma Yoresh Keben, there is no Yoresh Keben according to Rava. There actually is a Yoresh Keben because if there's Nechasim Muatim, but there's enough to feed the girls, just not enough for any real inheritance, we still divide whatever's left between the boys, and then the tumtum could theoretically get something. Why the Gemara doesn't answer that is a good question, but that's a side point. Ha'omer im yalda ishti zachar. Okay, now we're moving on and we get to the fun part of today's sugya, which is we're moving on to the second part of the Mishnah. And the second part of the Mishnah, and I pointed this out when we were reading the Mishnah, we have a case where a man, and we're going to kind of attack it from all sides. A man promises, if my wife gives birth to a male, I will give this child 100 zuz. And then we had a case where, and then again, if it's male, child gets 100 zuz. If not, child gets nothing. If it's a female, the father said, I'll give her 200 zuz. And then if it's female, she'll get 200 zuz. If not, if it's male, child won't get anything. If it's right, then we had the case where we said both. And then we said twins, right? They could both get, we had all different options. And then the whole thing was to get to the tumtum. But now we want to focus on the fact that this man promised 200 zuz if it was female, and he promised 100 zuz if it was male. L'meimra debata difa le mi ben. Wait, it sounds like, right? This is classic. Somebody promises a lot of money. It's because they're happy. It sounds like this father's going to be happier if he has a girl than a boy. Now, from what we've learned before, they always wanted male children. And in fact, we're going to quote a statement we've seen not so long ago. V'ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Kol she'eno meniach ben liyorsho. If you don't leave over a son because you have only daughters, HaKadosh Baruch Hu maleh alav evra. God is angry with this person, meaning it's really important to have male children, not as much female children. Shene'emar, how do we know this? And this was a drasha on a problem we have at the pasuk. V'ha'avaltem et nachalato lebito. The pasuk says if you don't have any male children, we pass over your inheritance to the girls, the daughters. Now, the language of Passover is a bit of a strange language because in all of that whole section, if you remember when we started laws of inheritance, we talked about that, we saw the psukim. And in all the other sections that if you don't have this, then titen nachalato. It will be given, the root of give, and not the root of Passover. Okay, why does the root of Passover have anything to do with this? Nothing to do with the Passover holiday. But ein avara elo evra. Now, the root aval, which is in to Passover, is also the same root as evra. Evra is anger. So, shene'emar yom evra hayom hahu. Okay, and that's how we know that evra is anger. So they say, here's a remez, as we say, an allusion in the pasuk to the fact that, allusion with an A, that really God is angry with someone who this happens to. And that's why they switch the language specifically in a case where there's no sons. So what do you see here? If God is angry with someone who has daughters and no sons, then obviously sons are better than daughters. And why was this father promising more money to the daughter than to the son? To which we're going to have three answers. So this is a very interesting, I think, a very interesting sugya. And particularly like one of the lines in the middle. L'inyan Yerusha ben adifle. L'inyan harvacha bito adifale. Well, really, we prefer sons. And certainly when it comes, or really, you could say it depends on the circumstances. But really what they're saying in the end, people still prefer sons. This has nothing to do with that. The issue with God being angry with you is because for Yerusha purposes, we prefer to have sons. Okay, they don't even talk about in general do people prefer male children or not, which we know there's all these sugyot that say that people really want to have male children. But what we're saying here is Yerusha, which usually means the nachala, and that makes sense. You want boys. Why is God angry? Because it messes up the whole master plan of this tribe here, this tribe there, this tribe there. If you have only daughters, the daughters inherit, and even though for a small time, right, they tried to marry they had to marry within their tribe. Over time, they didn't have to, and then the tribe's land gets passed over to a different nation, a different tribe. So that's not part of God's master plan. So when it comes to Yerusha, you'd rather have sons. And also, I think Yerusha was, the son taking over the father's place, which only a son can do. A daughter can't take the place of the father. It's different roles. But linyan harvacha, but what's the father doing in our Mishnah? Promising money to the child. Well, in terms of girls, they need the money more than boys. And that's why the father promised more money to the girls. It has nothing to do with that he was thrilled to have a girl, thrilled to have a boy. That's not the issue here. The issue is, how much money are they going to need in life? The boy's going to need more money than the less money than the girl, because the boy will eventually fend for himself. The girls always needed protection. And that's the first answer, which doesn't really help us in terms of the broader picture. Is possible they really prefer girls? Well, not really. Answer number 2. Shmuel amar hacha b'mevakeret askinan. Shmuel limits the Mishnah to a case where It was the firstborn child. What does that mean? Why is that important? Uchid Rav Chisda, and it follows Rav Chisda. The Amar Rav Chisda, bat tchila siman yafeh lebanim. Here we get to, well, it's actually better to have boys, but if you have a girl first, it's a good sign for sons later. What does that mean? We don't know when it talks about siman. Metaphysically, in an actual world, well, we're going to have two possible answers. Ikeda amre de mirbi ala afta. This is classic. People often say this when they have an older daughter. Oh, great, she'll take care of the other kids, right? There's this certain idea that it's great because if you have a girl first and then you have a lot of boys, it's amazing. The girl will be helpful in the house, be helpful to take care of the children. Or second answer, Ikeda amre de lo shalta be'ena bisha. Why is it a siman yafeh lebanim? Because you won't have ayin hara come upon you. What's ayin hara? Ayin hara is almost always associated with people will look at you and be jealous, or somehow jealousy. We'll talk about two possibilities of what the jealousy is here. Often it's usually the people will look at you and be jealous of you, and therefore you're better off having less, because then people won't look at you and be jealous and bring ayin hara. If people look at you and they're jealous and say, look how much that person has, right? Like take Eov as an example, right? The Satan came and said, look, Eov has everything, right? And then he lost everything. So we don't want people looking and saying you have everything. That's not a good thing. We've seen this many times. So better not to have sons at the beginning, because then it looks like this person has a lot of girls, and then people won't say, oh, look, person has so many sons. So even if you have sons later, it won't look as bad and it'll look as good, which then won't make people look at you. Some people explain it differently. It's not the ayin hara coming from the outside, is coming from the inside. If you have an older daughter, then the son won't get pishnayim because he's not a bechor. Well, then if the son gets pishnayim and you have a boy first, that causes internal fighting in the family, because the boys say, oh, it's unfair. He gets two portions. I only get one. And when you die, it's going to create all this inner fighting and jealousy in the family, which is going to bring ayin hara to the family. So there's two different ways of understanding what that could be, which were two different ways, which was the second answer of understanding what siman yafeh lebanim was of Rav Chisda. So what they're saying is we prefer girls if they're the oldest, that's a good thing. So there is a certain type, at least in this answer, there is a certain type of way of preferring girls, but it seems to be for ulterior motives, so to speak, which we're not exactly sure what that means. But here comes the big line, Amar Rav Chisda, uladidi, but to be honest with you, for me, Bintan adifan lami banai. I like my daughters better than my sons. It's a great line. Let's just remind us who were Rav Chisda's daughters. So Rav Chisda had daughters who married two brothers, Rami bar Chama and Ukvar bar Chama, who were big Talmidei Chachamim. And you might remember the story of his daughter when she was young, and Rava and Rami bar Chama were sitting there, and he said, who do you want to marry? And she said, both of them. And then in the end, she marries Rami bar Chama, and when he dies, she marries Rava. And I think he just was very impressed with his daughters, that they were, now, of course, what's great for a daughter in those days to have married a Talmid Chacham, but it obviously, that story shows that she understood what was important, and he had a lot of respect for his daughters, which was, even the fact that he asked her, who do you want to marry, gave her the choice almost. Not that she was actually choosing at that moment, she was a girl, but it's this story, and it's also just a story, but you see that he had this nice relationship with his daughters and respected them. So I don't know. I mean, he does have sons who come up in the Gemara. It's not like they weren't Talmidei Chachamim, but it's an interesting statement, and one of those good statements for us as women to read in the Gemara, that here comes someone and says, I actually prefer female children. Okay, third answer. Ibaitema, Hamani Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to have to figure out what is Rabbi Yehuda, but we're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda, in the end, seems very similar to answer number one. Some people try to differentiate, but in the end, it's going to come out at least kind of similar to answer number one, which is it's really about giving them money. So first we're going to figure out, though, hey, Rabbi Yehuda, which Rabbi Yehuda are we talking about? We know which Rabbi Yehuda. What we mean is which statement of Rabbi Yehuda shows this idea that the father's going to give more money to the girl than to the boy. So Ilema Rabbi Yehuda de Bakol, if you remember this, de Tanya Hashem Berachat Avraham Bakol, right? God bless Avraham with everything. What is everything? There's a machlok at Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to see a few machlokot Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, which somewhat go down similar lines. Rabbi Meir Omer Shelo Hayalo Bat. What does it mean? He had everything. He had only sons. Okay, that was his gift. Okay, which obviously means boys are better than girls. Having sons is better than having daughters. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shaitalo bat ubakol shma. What does it mean with everything? Her name was Bakol. Doesn't mean with everything. God blessed Abraham with Bakol. Bakol was his daughter. He had a daughter, and that was his blessing. So it sounds like it could be that Rabbi Yehuda that says it was a great thing, it was a blessing that he had a daughter. But that doesn't help us because what it really means there is that not only did he have sons, but God made sure he had a daughter as well, meaning it was complete. But doesn't mean that girls are better, right? That he preferred a daughter to a son. Right? You don't hear that it was better that he had a daughter than a son. Elaha Rabbi Yehuda. Must be this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Titania. Mitzvah lazonet habanot. Remember, this is all, we've made reference to this a few times in the last few shiurim, which was girls until age 6, you have to support them. That's a chova. After age 6, until you die, once you die, remember the estate has to support, and that's an obligation of the k'tuba b'na nukva. But in between that, from age 6 to age 12 and a half, till she gets married or till the father dies, it's not an obligation, but it is a mitzvah. That's what we're saying here. It's a mitzvah. Mitzvah is something in between. We did learn before, I told you, that the court can insist that we keep this, even though it's not theoretically an obligation, but the court does actually make sure that this happens. They get involved. So it's a mitzvah lazonat habanot. You have a commandment to, right? It's not really a commandment. It's just important. It's an important thing to do to feed the girls. The kavachomer labanim da'as kebetor divrei Rabbi Meir. And all the more so, you have an obligation to feed your sons because they learn Torah. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Okay, so according to Rabbi Meir, again, always preference to the boys. And why, right? Now, I want to point out what this is saying is, okay, don't get confused. This is not about kollel and paying people to learn. It's an obligation on a father to support his own children so that they learn Torah. Just like any one of you would say, I want to support my children to get a good education. That, right, in those days, they didn't really educate the women so much. Sometimes there were women who were educated, but generally they didn't. It wasn't seen as a community obligation. Everyone needs to support the children, the daughters to learn. But this is an obligation on the father to support his own children to learn so that they can learn. Feed them so they can learn. Okay, and this is obviously when they're young. We're not talking about kollel here. That's something else, where the community supports the people learning and they work so people can learn. That's not what this is talking about. It's important, right? And it makes a lot of sense. But the kavachomer is what Rabbi Meir is saying. Girls, it's important to support, but all the more so sons because they learn Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he has the reverse. Mitzvah lazonet habanim. Okay, for those who were just learning about kavachomer in Rabbanit Leah's class, right? This is a great kavachomer. Mitzvah lazonet habanim, kavachomer labanot deloli tazlan. It's a mitzvah to support your sons. Okay, perhaps so they can learn Torah, perhaps just because they're your sons and you should support them. All the more so your daughters, so that they don't humiliate themselves. It's humiliating for girls. Okay, now the Gemara in Tubon on Daf Samach Zayin on Bed, if you want to look back, says it's also an embarrassment for the boys, but they say it's worse for the girls. Okay, it's more embarrassing. The embarrassment of a girl who has to go knock on doors is worse than the embarrassment there is for boys. Okay, she's more humiliated by this activity than the boys. And therefore, okay, for whatever reason, we're not going to get into that today, and who knows why exactly, but, it could be in their society. That's the way it was. You can argue whether it's true today or not. But either which way, he basically says here, it's more important to support the girls, which then again sounds like the first example, which is this is a case where he's promising money to them. And because promising them money, it's for their livelihood, right? And that's why he's going to give more money to the girls because the kavachomer, it's more important to support the girls. Of course, if you were in Rabbanit's class or you've learned with me before, there's this concept of dayo, anything you learn from a kavachomer, right? It's the same, not more than. This ends up more than, okay? But this isn't a classic kavachomer. This is just explaining why the father promised more money to the girl than the boy. It's not a halachic kavachomer here that has to be under the principle of dayo, that it's only the same. But anyway, we'll put that point aside. Now so that was the first part of today's stop. Okay, we had 2 parts so far, just to review right now. We had Abaye and Rava, their debate about how to understand the case of the tumtum. Is a tumtum a unique entity, or is it a din of safek? And therefore, does the tumtum collect or not? We brought a braita to just to reject Abaye, but we resolved it. Then we went to the is it really true that a girl is better than a boy? People are more happy to have girls, and why did he promise her 200? And we basically had two ways of approaching it. Either saying, it's not really adif, it's just he wasn't happier, it's just he wanted to provide for her. The other type of answer was, no, he's really happier. Question is why exactly? Because it was talking about the firstborn, and it's good to have a girl firstborn, either because she's going to take care of the kids, or because it's you won't have ayin hara in the house. Okay, now we're going to move on, and then right, which didn't really say that girls are better than boys. It just said that there's ulterior reason why you would want to have girl. But Rav Chisda did come out and say himself that he prefers to have girls than boys. So that at least made us feel like, wow, there is someone who does, maybe it depends on your daughters and your sons. Although we all know we shouldn't choose favorites. Okay. Or if you do choose favorites in your family, at least you have Rav Chisda to go, have support for it. Now we're going to have two braita. Now we're moving on to the part where basically he promises this for that, depending on what happens. And we had all the different permutations. We had twins, we had tumtum, right? We basically said who gets what for what. So now we're going to bring two different braitot that have something similar to the Mishnah, but it doesn't really give us the details. It just says in a case like that, without saying what that is, if it's a son, it'll be this. If it's a daughter, it'll be that, or whatever it says. We'll see. And the Gemara wants to figure out what were the details of the case. Like, why did it come out like this? So that's what we're going to do. Tanya. It says in a braita, Yalda zachar unikeva. If there were twins born, hazachar notel shisha dinarim, vanekeva notelet shnei dinarim. So in the event that there were twins, now we don't know what came before this, what the father had promised. In the event that there are twins, the male gets 6 dinarim. Okay, let's talk about what dinarim are. Dinarim are the same as zuzim, but that's only dinarim if they're silver dinarim. They were silver and they were gold, just to confuse you. So the gold dinarim are worth 25 of the silver. So whenever we say 200 zuz, that's 200 dinarim, but 200 silver dinarim. When we go to the gold, 2 dinarim is worth 50. So 50 zuzim, 50 silver dinarim, because 2 times 25. Okay, they're 25 each. 6 dinarim is 150. So for make this simpler, we're just going to go with 150 and 50. Okay, so if you have twins, the girl gets 50, the boy gets 150. To which the Gemara asks, "B'mai, what was the case?" So Amar Rav Ashi, Amarita Lishmati Kamei Rav Kahana. So Rav Ashi says, I brought this to Rav Kahana b'misares. Misares usually means cut off, but what he really means here is it was split, meaning the father had a split statement, meaning the father said, if it's in this order, then I'll give this. If it's in that order, I'll give that. And then we're going to see, and we don't know who was born first. Okay? So if the children are born in this order, say the following. Damar zachar tchila matayim nikeva acharav velo klum. Said if the male is born first, by the way, this sounds like the father knew they were having twins, which is interesting in and of itself. Possibly he just meant if the children are born in this order, meaning my first child, my second child, and then it ended up twins, it's also possible. So he said if the male is born first, then the male will get 200. Nikeva acharav velo klum. And the daughter's born second, she won't get anything. Okay, so if it's born male, female, male gets 200, the daughter gets nothing. Nikeva tchila maneh, zachar achareha maneh. If the female is born first, she'll get 100. And if the male is born after her, he'll get 100. So either which way, he's giving out 200. It just depends on the order. Either the male will get everything or the female, and the male will split it. And then obviously what happened, as I already told you, Yalda zachar unikeva v'lo yadinan heminai unafak b'reisha. This is why it's obvious it was twins, because otherwise you would obviously know who was born first. But the children were born. We don't know what order they were born in. And therefore, so now let's go. Well, he promised 200 zuz, but either the male gets everything, 200, or they split it 50-50. Either which way, the male was promised 100. So the first 100 definitely goes to the male. Zachar shakil mana mimanavsha. Because either way, whether he was born first or second, he at least gets 100. Because remember, 100 is included within 200. So he definitely gets 100. Idach mana, the other 100, have mamona mutal b'safek v'chokim. And the other 100 is a classic case of we don't know who gets it, and therefore we split it 50-50. And that's why she ends up with 50, and he ends up with 150. Next case. Haditanya yalda zachar unikeva en lo ela maneh. Now, in a different case, it's a different braita. It said if there were twins born, then all he gets is a maneh. Now, he sounds like the boy, not the girl. It's not so clear what this means. And what are we talking about? So, hechi mishkachala, what's the case? Amar Ravina ben mivasreini. Ravina said, oh, this is a different case. This is not that the father, until now we've been talking about the father promised the child that is born. But this is a case where the father promised whoever tells me what my wife had. Okay, so he says the following. Okay, we'll see. But let's say, for example, whoever tells me that my wife gave birth to a boy will get this. Whoever told me my wife gave birth to a girl will get this. And the promise of the money is to the mivaser. Okay, we're obviously talking about a situation different, usually different from today. Okay, unfortunately now we're in
off your iPad first.
Stop. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. Okay. Now, first of all, in those days, it was very common the man was not present at the birth. First of all, could have been traveling and wants someone to come and tell him. Could have been, just not in the room and is waiting for someone to come out and tell him what the story is. Could be all sorts of situations. Nowadays, unfortunately, people are in war, and that situation actually happens more common these days than otherwise. But usually nowadays, the husband's around if there's not some other circumstances. But basically, this person is very excited to hear the news and promises someone, whoever gives him like a reward, you tell me what happened, I'll pay you some money. So here goes the case. Turning now to Amud Bet, Titania. And here we have a braita specifying the case. There's a problem a bit with the girsa, so I'm going to add some extra words in the middle based on the commentaries. Whoever tells me what now, Peta Rechem usually means firstborn. So some people think this is who the firstborn of my wife she gave birth to was. Some people think it's just Peta Rechem means that came out of the womb of my wife. So it could be just, whatever was born. It wasn't necessarily talking about the firstborn. That's not so important in either which way for us. So whoever tells me, im zachal, if they tell me I had a boy, yitol maneh, I will give him 100. So if that was what he said, we're going to have a bunch of different options of what this person said, the quote. If he said, and this is just like our Mishna, right? It's just the Mishna was promising if my wife gives birth to a zachar, the zachar will get. This is saying if someone tells me my wife gave birth to a male, I will give him 100. So if Yalda zachar, no tel maneh. So if someone tells him your daughter had a male, he'll get 100. If someone comes and says your daughter had a female child, a girl, won't get the money because that's not what the father promised. Im nikeva maneh, what if he said, I'll pay you if you tell me I had a daughter. I'll pay you 100. So obviously, Yalda nikeva, no tel maneh. If someone comes and says you had a daughter, he'll get 100. Obviously, if someone says you had a son, they will not get any money. Yalda zachar, okay, here come the extra words you need. It doesn't say what the person said. Im zachal maneh, im nikeva maneh. Okay, so we'll add these words. If the person said, if it's a male, you'll get 100. If it's a female, you'll get 100. Basically meaning whatever it is, you tell me, I will give you 100. Yalda zachar unikeva ein lo ela maneh. And that's what we're talking about. That was the phrase that we saw before. When it said in the braita, Yalda zachar unikeva ein lo ela maneh, what this is saying is, if the person comes and said you had twins, right? The person said, if I had a male, 100, if I had a female, 100. Person comes and says you had twins, both a male and female, he only gets 100. He doesn't get 200 because he said male and female. So now the Gemara has a bit of a problem. Gemara says, this doesn't make any sense. Hazachar unikeva lo amal. He didn't say, if my wife has twins, I'll give you 100. He said, if you tell me my wife has a girl or a boy, I'll give you 100. He didn't say a girl and a boy. And maybe he's not happy to hear he had twins. Here, if you're a twin, you might get offended, but let's try to put ourselves in this person's shoes and think about why the father might not be very happy to get the message that he had twins. He wanted either a boy or a girl. He didn't want both because either. Okay, and the Ramban gives all three reasons, which I think the Ramban gives three possible reasons. So I'm quoting the Ramban. The Ramban says either he's upset because his wife, he's thinking about his poor wife who went through labor with twins and, it could be a lot worse and more challenging. Number two, a lot of children in those days, right? That was also before epidurals and all that and ways to deal with the pain. Number two, a lot of people in those days, a lot of times twins didn't make it. So there was concern that maybe the twins won't make it. That's number two. Number three option is obviously what we talked about before. the burden of the sustenance of this child is upon him, and that of two children rather than one. And that is a bit of a shock to this person. And maybe he's not so happy about having to now support two children rather than one. So those are possible reasons why he could claim, oh, that's not what I meant. And again, right? It's not clear that he meant twins, and therefore he shouldn't have to pay. To which the Gemara answers, fine. It must be the Amar Nami im Zachar im Nekeva Nami Yitol Maneh. It must be, already we changed the girsa, but it must be the person said, if Zachar Maneh, if Nekeva Maneh, if Zachar and Nekeva, I'll also give you a Maneh, and that's when the person only gets a Maneh. Okay, now the Gemara says, Limute Mai. Well, if the person gave all the possibilities, it made more sense when the person said, oh, I really want a son, so if you tell me a son, I'll give you 100. Or I really want a daughter, if you tell me a daughter, I really want 100. Or I really only want one child, so if you tell me one child, I'll give you the money I won't if you have two children. But if he gave all the possibilities, and either which way he's giving 100, or, we also had the cases before where if this 100, that's 200, but if either which way it's going to be 100, then why did the father have to say all those possibilities? To which they answer, what he was trying to say is, which is really the hope of every parent, which is, I want to make sure the child is viable. That's what I'm going to be excited about. I don't care if it's 1, 2, male, female, right? This is what every parent should be saying, right? And most parents, this is their reaction, right? I'm happy, whatever it is. And I'm just happy that the child is viable. So that's the end of that section, which that section, as I said, really came to take these two braitot, which didn't really give us the details of the case. And in one, we had Rabbi Ashi, who filled in the details. And in the other one, we had Rav Huna, who told us it was a case of mivasreini, which shifted the whole case, which was not to promise the children, but to promise whoever is the messenger telling the news. And then we had a braita to support Rav Huna that went into all the details. Now we're going to move to a case, and this is going to take us till the end of today's daf. A man said to his wife, there was a case that happened. He said to his wife, she was pregnant, he was dying. I am promising all my property to the fetus in your womb when the fetus, when the child is born. Okay, whatever child is born, this child will get all of my money. Amar Rav Huna, lo kana. Comes Rav Huna and says this was a meaningless statement because, okay, this goes all into, how the halacha treats an ubar, and it's a fascinating sugya. Is a fetus treated as a potential, child, or is it really not treated as significant? So comes Rav Huna and says, again, you could say maybe this doesn't have to do with, abortion and things like that, but it could stand as a basis to see different approaches about how we treat fetuses. So Rav Huna says, you're mezakeh le'ubar. You're giving over, you're doing a transaction basically with an unborn, with a fetus. V'mezakeh le'ubar lo kana. You can't do that. This is, we know this already. Remember, you can't give something to someone who's not in existence. Okay, we'll talk about what the difference. We'll get to that soon. Okay, that sounds totally reasonable. We've learned this before. But wait, what was our Mishna then? Our Mishna was all about promising a gift to an unborn child. So that doesn't make sense. So comes Rav Nachman and says, Eitive Rav Nachman le Rav Huna. Rav Nachman says against Rav Huna, you're saying something against an explicit Mishnah. Ha'omel im yalda ishti zachar yitol maneh. Yalda zachar notel maneh. Says if my wife gives birth to a male, the child will get 100. And if the child is born, the Mishnah says the child gets 100. So what do you mean you can't give over something to an unborn child? To which Rav Huna answers very simply, Amarle, Mishnatenu Eini Yodea Mishnah. I don't know who is the author of this Mishnah. Basically dismisses the Mishnah entirely and says, this Mishnah makes no sense to me. I don't have to hold by it because, right? And we've seen many other cases where it goes like Rav Huna, where we don't view this ubar as being able to acquire anything, and therefore a promise to a fetus is not a real promise. So that's the case. Okay, why does this go till the end of the daf? Because what the Gemara is going to try to do right now is suggest 7 possibilities. We'll see 6 of them today, the 7th tomorrow, as to how Rav Huna theoretically could have explained the Mishnah. Okay, part of what he says is, I don't know who says this. So some of the answers are going to be, here, I'll find you an opinion that holds this way. And the Mishnah could be that person's opinion. You might not hold by it, but you can't say, I don't know who taught the Mishnah. The Mishnah could be this person's opinion. So we're going to have a slew of possible answers like that. That's going to be 4 answers. And then we're going to have 3 answers that are going to be what we say ukimtot, or saying the Mishnah was talking about a particular situation, not the way we thought, which could have also explained the Mishnah. But all 7 possibilities are going to be rejected, which is going to then go back and explain why Rav Huna paskined against our Mishnah, because he didn't hold by our Mishnah. So after we had a whole dealing with our Mishnah, now we see we don't even hold like the Mishnah. So here are 6 out of 7 possibilities. Classic. We always go back to this. Why don't we say it's Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir holds that you can pass on, can't do a transaction with something that's not yet in existence. But we're going to reject that because, as we've rejected this, we've used this answer many times. Rabbi Meir says you can be makneh, you can pass over an item to someone if that item is not yet in existence. But you can pass it on to someone who is in existence. But Rabbi Meir never said that you can pass on an item to someone who's not in existence. Usually the classic case of Rabbi Meir is, I'm giving you the fruits of this tree. The tree doesn't have fruits yet, but it's going to have fruits. And you can pass on ungrown, not yet, fruits that are not yet grown to someone who's here. But you can't pass on something even that's in existence to someone who's not in this world. And this is the to someone and not the object that we're passing on. We're passing on money that exists to someone who's not yet in the world. Even Rabbi Meir doesn't hold by that. Second option, V'lei malei, Rabbi Yossi. This is a bit of a more complicated case, but Rabbi Yossi had a unique opinion that ubar kani, that an ubar can acquire things. Okay, why did he think a fetus can acquire things? Ditnan, or how do we know this? So you have to have some background. If a person is a Kohen, married to a non-Kohen, and leaves children, okay, he dies, the Kohen dies, there's children, and there's slaves, Canaanite slaves. Now, Canaanite slaves in a Kohen's household Canaanite slaves in a Kohen's household can eat truma. But if the father dies and there's no children, okay, if there's children, then it becomes the possession of the children. The slaves are immediately inherited by the children, and the children are Kohanim, obviously, because the father's Kohen. Children are Kohanim, so great, the slaves continue to eat truma. If there's no children, then the slaves don't eat truma, okay, because now they're not owned by, right, let's say, well, it depends who they go to, but let's say they get it somehow in the wives, they're considered the wives, well, then there's no truma. She can't eat truma, and if she takes them with her, and depending on how the inheritance worked out, but we'll just say then the slaves can't eat truma anymore. So what if she's pregnant? Now we're going to have pregnant in both cases. One is where there are children already, and one is where there aren't children. So the first case, ditnan, it says in a Mishnah, ubal posel. This is a fascinating thing. The Rashbam quotes this, that it's the statement is ubar b'me'ez zara zalhu. In ubar, so this ubar is going to be born, he'll be a Kohen. But when he's unborn, he's actually considered a non-Kohen. So, assuming, okay, we don't know it's a male, okay, but because it's potentially a male, this slave, while the ubar the fetus is just a fetus, it's considered not a Kohen. When it'll be born, he'll be a Kohen. But when he's unborn, he's not a Kohen. And comes Rabbi Yossi and he says, he's koneh already. This slave is now owned by the brothers and by this unborn child when the father dies. So, right, the father dies while the mother's pregnant. The child now causes the slave not to be able to eat truma because it now has an owner who's not a Kohen. Fascinating. So that's the first part. So what do you see? Ubar is koneh. That's already our point. Ve'eno ma'achil means, but if there were no children, the fact that there's an unborn fetus, because on the same principle, it's considered a zar. It's not a Kohen. So it's not like she has a potential child, even though she does, but we don't rule halachically, we can't let these slaves eat truma right now, because until the child's born, it's considered a non-Kohen. That's divrei Rabbi Yossi. To which they say, why don't we say the Mishnah's him? The new bar could be koneh. That's what you see here. They say, no. Shana Yerusha ba'me eleha. That's Yerusha that comes automatically. In other words, the father dies and the slave is automatically inherited. That's not somebody promising something extra to the children. That you can't do, even according to Rabbi Yossi. when it's an unborn child, which would then not be able to explain our Mishnah, which is someone promising something extra, not the inheritance that's an automatic. An automatic could go to an ubar, but not something not automatic. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Broki, maybe it's Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Remember him? Shenema Dama Loshna Yerusha Veloshna Matana. Now, what did he say? If you want to prefer a son among sons, daughter among daughters, right? If the daughters are inheriting, whoever's oily or show were his words. It doesn't matter if you're doing the language of Yerusha. It doesn't matter if you're doing the language of Matana. You can prefer one over the others. And what does this have to do with the fetus? Well, look at his language. And now we're going to understand it in a way we didn't understand it until today. Ditnan Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omel. Im amal al misha oily or show. If we say it about someone who potentially can inherit, it works. Now, the way we understood potentially to inherit meant a son or a daughter if their daughters are inheriting. But the way they understand it is oily or show potentially could be an heir because it's a fetus right now. And that makes that fetus a potential heir. And then you can give it to them, even language of Yerusha, even language of Matana, and it works. That would work. That would answer our question. To which the Gemara says, who says that's what he means? He was talking about someone who's Ra'uli or show who's in this world, not how do you know he said it about an unborn child? Doesn't make any sense. Okay, option number 4. Maybe you could say that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka holds like Rabbi Yossi, that a newborn can be Kone, Yerusha, and therefore he is Ra'uli or show when he's in utero, which means that we can then say that even you can prefer that child. That would be a possible way of saying it. And this is going to be our last option to find a tannaitic opinion. We're saying it's Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka who holds like Rabbi Yossi, which the Gemara says, obviously, miyemer de severla. We have no idea if Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka holds like Rabbi Yossi. In order for that to be true, the Mishna would have to be Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, and he would have to hold like Rabbi Yossi. We have no idea. So it's hard to say that. Okay, so those were 4 possibilities to say it was a tannaitic opinion. Either is Rabbi Meir, who said Adam davar shelo ba'olam, we rejected, or it's Rabbi Yossi, who said Ubar is Kone. We said, no, that was different. That was Yerusha that just happened, not Yerusha that we're initiating. Then we had Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, and then we have perhaps Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka with Rabbi Yossi, which would work, but we have no idea that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka holds like Rabbi Yossi. Okay, now we're going to do 5 and 6. Why don't you just do an ukimta and say the whole Mishna isn't talking about the father promising the child like we thought. It's like the braita we saw at the top of this Amud, which is the father promising whoever tells the father. And that is a person that's in this world. That could totally work. But the Gemara says that can't be because look at the end of the Mishnah. If you're going to say the whole Mishnah is talking about that, well, the last line in the Mishnah, the katani seifa, ihachi, if you say that, the katani seifa, v'im sham yoresh elohu yoresh hakol. Remember, the whole Mishnah was all about the tumtum. We got off of that, but it was about the tumtum, and it said in the end, well, if there's only a tumtum, if there's no other children, then the tumtum is definitely going to be yoresh. Even if we say the whole Mishnah is talking about someone who's telling us whether the child was born and what the child was, well, Yoresh Mayavidite, what does that have to do with Yerusha? Yerusha is if the child's a tumtum and is he like the boy, the girl? That's a totally different thing. That has nothing, we're obviously talking about the child itself and not the fetus and the unborn child and not some giving it to somebody who promised, who gave you the message. Okay, 6th option. We talked about the fact the father's not on scene. Maybe what the father's saying is when the father says, I'm promising this to my wife if she gives birth to a son, maybe it doesn't mean if she gives birth to a son. I'm promising this, to my child, if the child is born a male or if the child is born a female. Maybe what the father's saying is, my wife already gave birth, I don't know what it is. But if it's a girl, I'm giving the girl this. Or if it's a boy, I'm giving the boy that. But it's already after the child's in this world. It's just the father's not with the child. Well, ihachi, this also doesn't work because the katani seifa, look at the language of the Mishnah. It says, v'imamar kol ma sheteled ishti yitol. If he says, whatever my wife gives birth to, we'll take, hareze yitol, then, they get whatever he promised, even the tumtum will get. Kol sheteled, it doesn't make sense. Whatever she gives birth to, it should be kol sheyaldam ebaili. The language doesn't work because it should say, whatever my wife gave birth to. So this answer doesn't work. Like I said, we'll see one more answer in tomorrow's daf. With that, we'll finish this section. So what were we doing in this part? We already reviewed the earlier parts. I'm just going to review from here. We brought in this case that happened. It came before Rav Huna. And Rav Huna said, The ubar doesn't get anything. The father promised all of his property. The ubar doesn't get. How does that compare to our Mishnah? Oh, Rav Huna just dismisses our Mishnah. And the Gemara tried very hard to try to say, why didn't Rav Huna say, this is the Mishnah? The Mishnah is either according to someone or in a particular case that we didn't think the Mishnah was talking about. But all these possibilities are rejected. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, and may we have B'sorot Tovot.